All right, so today we're diving into a story that I think a lot of people will find both really intriguing and really unsettling.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking into the life of John Wayne Gacy. And I mean, you know him, you probably know him as a notorious killer. But we're trying to go a little beyond just the headlines today. We're going to be digging into the research we've done and some biographical accounts, try and get a better grasp on just how complex this man was, who lived this insane double life.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. Because on the surface, you have John Wayne Gacy, born in Chicago in '42, a seemingly normal childhood, right?
Yeah.
Middle childhood, right? Nothing stands out to you at first. But then how does that same childhood lead to the horrific crimes that he committed? So that's the kind of puzzle that we're going to try to put together today.
For sure. And to do that, I think it makes sense to start right at the beginning with his early years. And the sources that we're looking at, they paint this picture of Gacy as like almost normal.
Yeah.
Described as even like kind and courteous by some. But then as you get a little deeper, you see this really troubling dynamic between him and his father.
Definitely, his father was a heavy drinker and also both physically and verbally abusive. And he would often belittle John Wayne, calling him names like queer and sissy, which are terms that are obviously loaded with all of the societal expectations of the time, and definitely damaging, I'm sure, to a young boy's sense of self.
Yeah, it's like his father was pushing his own insecurities onto his son.
Yeah.
You know, trying to force him into this idealized version of masculinity. And one anecdote that I thought was really interesting was how Gacy's dad would destroy any forts that he built, except for one.
Oh, yeah, the hidden right.
Yeah.
That's such a telling detail. I mean, it suggests that from a young age, Gacy was learning to compartmentalize.
Yeah.
You know, to hide parts of himself, just to survive in this hostile environment. And you can almost see the foundation for his double life being built right there in those early experiences.
That's a really interesting point. So it's not just like he had a hard childhood or anything, but it's the coping mechanisms that he developed that are really interesting. And it wasn't just hiding either. Even as a kid, Gacy had this real drive. I mean, he was making money. He was organizing other children in these money-making schemes.
Totally. And you see this need for control, this drive to always be right, even if it means, you know, bending the truth a little. And that manifested so early on. It's almost like looking back, it was a premonition of the manipulation that would define him later in life.
It's true. So we've got this complex childhood, this need to control, and then adolescence hits. And it seems like Gacy is trying on all these different masks, trying to figure out who he is, or maybe who he wants people to think he is. Outwardly, he was generally well-behaved, dated girls.
Right. But even then, there are these hints of a darker side. Like, he was reportedly super into death, even to the point where he climbed into a coffin at one point.
Oh, wow. See, that's chilling to me. This morbid curiosity. But it's existing at the same time as this carefully crafted, like normal person facade. It's giving me chills just talking about it. And it seems like the thing that was driving him this whole time was this deep need for approval. And that probably goes back to his dad and the constant criticism.
Oh, absolutely. He was desperate for recognition for his success, almost to prove his father wrong. But then there's this huge turning point, something that cracks that facade that he had built. His arrest in 1968 for sodomy.
And it's important for our listeners to understand that charge back then had a much broader definition than it does today. And it came with a huge social stigma. And it's this arrest that really starts to unravel things for Gacy. So he's charged.
Yeah.
But he still clings to this image of himself as a successful young man. He moves to the suburbs. He gets remarried, starts his own business.
But then you see this really ominous pattern start to emerge. He's hiring all these teenage boys. There are tons of disputes over wages. And tragically, a lot of these young men just vanish. It's like this dark undercurrent that's pulling him back in no matter how hard he tries to outrun it.
I mean, it really does sound like he was trying to build this whole new life for himself out in the suburbs, trying to escape what happened with that arrest. But it's like the darkness was still there.
Yeah.
You know? Just kind of hiding under the surface.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this whole period so fascinating and honestly so terrifying.
Yeah.
Because you have this classic double life playing out right. Like on the one hand, you have John Gacy, this seemingly upstanding citizen. He's dressing up as Pogo the Clown, performing at parties and charity events. I mean, he even met First Lady Rosalind Carter.
It's crazy to think about, right? This outwardly generous, community-minded guy shaking hands with the First Lady. But all the while,
these horrific acts are happening in the shadows. Like, how do you reconcile those two things? It's really impossible. And yet that's the reality we're dealing with. And the truly scary part is those dark impulses, they don't go away. In fact, they escalate. And this is where we get to the truly horrifying stuff that's described in the sources. Like, the discovery of those human remains in his crawl space.
Right, 29 victims,
Ah.
29 young lives taken and just discarded like that in his house. It's tough to even wrap your head around.
And what gets me is the organized nature of it all. The way he chose his victims, the methods he used, it wasn't impulsive at all. Like everything points to premeditation, this really disturbing level of control.
So we're talking about someone who's out there putting on this nice guy act, even a benevolent act. I mean, Pogo the Clown, but behind closed doors, it's calculated cruelty. I mean, how do we even begin to understand what kind of person does something like that?
Well, the sources point to antisocial personality disorder, which would explain some of it, the lack of empathy, the need to manipulate people. But even with that diagnosis, it still blows my mind a little. How can someone be so normal on the outside, functioning in society, holding down a job, but then be capable of such awful things?
It's mind-boggling for sure. It's almost like that mask he wore in public. He started to believe in it himself, and that's how he was able to justify these urges, these compulsions, like they were totally separate from his everyday life.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a pattern you see in a lot of serial killers, this kind of disconnect from reality, creating these elaborate fantasies, these alternate realities, almost to make peace with the things they've done.
Wow, yeah. So then the trial happens. He's charged with all of these horrible crimes. Pleads insanity, but
But the jury doesn't buy it. I mean, the evidence was overwhelming, the sheer number of victims. He's convicted and sentenced to death for 33 murders.
and even in prison, facing the death penalty, that need for control doesn't go away. He starts writing to researchers, to people on the outside, even selling his artwork. It's like this desperate attempt to hold on to some kind of image, control the narrative.
Totally. It's really fascinating when you think about it. This deep-seated human need to control how we're perceived. Even in the face of death, like even facing execution, he wants to have some say in how he'll be remembered.
It's kind of chilling when you put it that way. And, even with the trial and the guilty verdict, there are still so many questions. Could more have been done to stop him sooner? Were there signs, warnings that people missed? And what was it that drove him to do these things in the first place?
Those are the questions that really stay with you. And that's why we keep doing these deep dives, to try and understand the darkest parts of human nature. And maybe, just maybe, if we can wrap our heads around the incomprehensible, we can find ways to prevent these tragedies from happening again.
And it's like this was all happening in plain sight, right? Just your average neighborhood with families and kids and community events and stuff. But behind it all was this darkness that nobody really saw.
That's exactly why this case is still so fascinating to people. And horrifying, honestly, because it proves that evil isn't always obvious. It doesn't always, wear a sign. It can be right next door, hiding in plain sight. Behind a smile, a charming personality. I mean, even a clown costume, for crying out loud.
No, totally. It makes you wonder who your neighbors really are.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that stood out to me in the research was how Gacy manipulated his victims. Like, it wasn't always just violence. He would use their insecurities against them. Things like needing work, wanting to be accepted to belong somewhere.
Oh, he was a master manipulator, no doubt. He knew exactly what these young men needed and wanted, and he twisted it all around to get what he wanted. It's terrifying when you think about how easily predators can do that, how they can use seemingly harmless tactics to get close to their victims.
And, the fact that he was so involved in the community. I mean, he even met Rosalind Carter. It's almost like those connections gave him cover. Like it helped him solidify that image of himself as a good guy, as someone you could trust.
Exactly. It's a classic move for people who live double lives. You build up this perfect public image. That's the exact opposite of what you're really like. It's almost like they're trying to convince themselves as much as everyone else.
So we've talked a lot about John Wayne Gacy, about how complex he was and the awful things that he did. But what can we take away from all of this? What can we learn that might help prevent something like this from happening again?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that you can't always judge a book by its cover. Evil can look like anyone. So we have to be vigilant, question our assumptions, and most importantly, trust our gut. If something feels off about someone, no matter how charming they seem, you have to listen to that feeling.
That's good advice. And I think it's really important to remember that behind all the headlines and the craziness of this case, there were real victims. These were people with families and friends who loved them, and their lives were cut way too short.
Absolutely. And their stories deserve to be remembered. We have to honor their memories by learning from what happened, by working to make sure that something like this never happens again.
I think that's a good place to leave it for today. The case of John Wayne Gacy is a truly horrifying look into the dark side of human nature. But it also shows us how important it is to be vigilant, to have empathy for others, and to never underestimate the power of human connection. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.